Aparna is trying to join, but she can't find out the link, she is saying.
Okay. Let her join and then we can admit her. Partha, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, welcome to this session, which we are, able to start at a scheduled time on the scheduled day. And that is because Rajarshi and Shovik have very kindly and thoughtfully arranged with the football authorities in FIFA to start the matches this evening after we have finished our lecture session. So there will be no disruptions. So thank you, Rajarshi and Shovik. So today we will return to Durkheim, and we will look at what is many people regard as his most important book. This is the last major work in his life, published in 1912. The book is called The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. It's his major contribution to the sociological study of religion. So let me go to my okay. So first published in 1912. Now, we will return to this topic of religion because if you remember, we briefly discussed the question of religion in Marx when we were speaking of his early work on the Jewish question. Also, it was somewhat tangentially a part of our discussion when we discussed the fetishism of commodities. This time we will, we also then, of course, looked at Weber and Weber's understanding of the role of the Protestant religion in the rise of capitalism. And we will have occasion to discuss the sort of distinctions between the approaches of Weber and Marx in relation to Durkheim. So Durkheim also recall our discussion of Durkheim's basic methodological premises for constructing a science of sociology. As I told you, Durkheim was particularly keen to establish sociology as a science on the model of the physical sciences. So it should have both a core of abstract theory, which was based upon certain axioms. So what is often called the hypothetico-deductive model, that is to say, a set of theories which proceeds from certain fundamental assumptions, axioms, and then the theoretical propositions are deduced, and then those theoretical propositions are then checked or confirmed against empirical observations, which is the entire sort of experimental and other empirical aspects of the scientific disciplines. So Durkheim was very much concerned to establish the sociological discipline, the discipline of sociology on the methods, based on those kinds of methods. So it should have a core of rational theory, and those theoretical propositions must be based upon on practices in the real world of society, where through empirical observations, those scientific propositions would be either confirmed, verified, or in fact found unsatisfactory and so rejected. So that was his basic method, and he is following that method in this book to propose what he thinks are the basic, essential characteristics or aspects of religion. So he says at the very beginning, the introduction, he says that he will examine the most primitive and simple religion known. That is to say, he will look at the evidence, empirical evidence. These are basically ethnographies done by other people. Durkheim did not do any ethnography of primitive peoples himself, but he was basically using the material that other people had gathered on the basis of ethnographic studies. We will come to this in a minute, mostly in Australia, the Aboriginal peoples of Central Australia, and some ethnographies of the Native American people in North America. So these Durkheim identified as the most primitive peoples known, and so he assumed that they would have extremely simple forms of social life, of social organization. And the understanding here was that if you looked at the most primitive peoples and found what was essential to their religion, we would have the most essential aspects of religion itself, right? And as we will see, he is essentially adopting methods from the sciences of biology and chemistry. We'll come to this in a minute. But his first major hypothesis is that religion is an essential and permanent aspect of humanity. All human societies have religion. This is his first claim. Even the most primitive human society known had religion. Now, why do they have religion? All religions translate some human need, or else they would not have existed. Now, this is another very important claim that Durkheim is making. It is part of his method, and we will see what this leads to. It's a functionalist method. If there are specific social institutions or practices which have existed in a society over a long time, then they must fulfill some function, some need, because otherwise those institutions or practices would not have lasted for so long. So this is the key presumption behind the method. Why is Durkheim looking? He wants to study religion. Why is he looking at the most primitive people? Because his claim is, if we can find and identify religion among those people, then those forms we can take to be the most elementary forms of religion in human society, because those are the earliest, the most fundamental or basic, as he says, elementary stage, right? And so if those forms can be shown to exist over time, so that you will find those elements recurring in later, more complex, more developed societies, then you could say that we have identified the most essential universal element in religion, in all religions that have existed in all of human society. Okay, so this is he's proceeding in this way. This will also lead to a very important scientific position, which is that no religions are false. So the question of religions being false or true, which of course is a part of a great deal of religious discourse. So we know of many religions in the world whose followers would regard the beliefs or practices of other religions as false. Okay? Durkheim is clearly not taking up a position from within any particular religion. And so this is another part of his scientific method. How do we study religion? We may, as an individual or as a member of a community, I may be part of a particular religion. I may have been born into a religion. I may actually practice a particular religion, right? I may actually subscribe to the beliefs of a particular religion. But in my position as a sociologist of religion, that is to say, a scientist, I must take a position which is outside even my own practiced religion. I must take up a position from outside. And therefore, I would not regard any religion that I find, even the most primitive, we may, they may be classified as barbaric and so on and so forth. But the sociologist of religion must regard all religions as true in their own fashion. True in their own fashion. That is to say, every religion must have its own internal justification, right? People who follow that religion within that community must have their own reasons, okay? And the task of the sociologist is to identify and understand those reasons, right? So all those reasons are equally religious. All religions are equally religious. So this is another very important sort of sociological premise that Durkheim is approaching, proposing, because what it is doing is it is moving away. Durkheim is moving away from a lot of even fairly well advanced 19th century discussions of comparative religion. Because in discussions of comparative religion, as we know, even though they did take a lot of these European scholars took a lot of interest in other religions to find out, to read their texts, to find out what their beliefs were, etc., etc. But they very often ended up with a certain hierarchy of religions, and certain religions were pronounced to be developed through usually religions which were monotheistic and had abstract conceptions of the divine, etc., etc. So they had religions which produced a lot of abstract philosophical texts. Those were pronounced to be advanced religions. And then you came down to the religion of the primitives, which were all understood to be often barbaric, certainly backward. And so this hierarchy was very much a part of the 19th century, the more textual understanding of religious study. Durkheim is proposing to move away from that completely, to take up this, what he claims to be the proper scientific position, which would regard all religions in every possible human society that we know of. Some of these may only be historical accounts of societies which probably do not exist anymore. In fact, as we know, for instance, by Durkheim's time, we already have good accounts of, let us say, ancient Egyptian peoples and religions, because a lot of archaeological evidence is being unearthed. And so a lot of evidence of ancient societies was emerging, and there were discoveries of the forms of religious practice in those kinds of societies. And again, so, they very often, so in a sense, very interestingly, the term civilization would emerge. So we would, as we still often do, speak of ancient Egyptian civilization, ancient Sumerian civilization, etc., and all the way into Greek and the Islamic and so on and so forth, Chinese, but Vedic, right? But those become civilizations, carrying the implication that they were developed religions with abstract philosophical systems and large expanse of sort of material well-being, wealth, and so on and so forth. So that would characterize a civilization. And compared to that, there were the primitive peoples, who are very often simply called uncivilized, because they did not have any of this. They probably, most of the time, they were not literate cultures. They did not have any textual material at all. And so that hierarchy was very much there between civilization and barbarism, right? But Durkheim is proposing to move away from this, because for him, even the Aboriginal tribes of Australia had religion which, for a scientist, would demand the same serious attention as, let us say, Judaism or Buddhism or any developed world religion. Okay, all are equally religious. So what was his method? Pick out the permanent elements that form the objective content of religion in general. You have to identify those elements that are permanent. Which are the elements you find in all known evidence of religion in society, in different kinds of human society? The method of science is to proceed from simple to complex cases, right? Look at ever-present causes, which are found in the most simple case. So he is proposing to learn from the methods of chemistry and biology. Now here, an idea of evolution is implicit in this, because and he actually discusses this in the introduction to this book. Just as in biology, one proceeds from the simplest organism, which is the single cell organism, and an organism, a living organism, which has only a single cell, right? And then you proceed to look at living bodies, which are more complex with many cells, and how, for instance, from that simple cell, which will give the scientist the clue to what is absolutely essential to a living biological body, right? The single cell organism. Similarly, in chemistry, when you think of the chemistry that you may have read in school, for instance, you have the basic elements. Okay, you may have seen a periodic table. The basic elements, and what 100 odd elements which have been identified, which form the basic material core of matter itself. All physical matter consists of the sum of one or more of these elements, which are combined in more and more complex forms, molecules and then compounds of different kinds. So that is the method of chemistry. You have to find what is the most elementary, the elements. Okay, that is what Durkheim is proposing here. Now, if you compare this with what Marx had suggested, or certainly Weber, which Weber we've looked at greater length. For instance, this is very different from Weber's ideal type. You will remember, Weber ideal type, he proposes that in order to understand the essence of a religion, you have to identify a representative type, which is the ideal. That type which the religion thinks is the highest form of development of that religion, right? Identify that ideal type, and then proceed to look at actual history or look at actual society and see how there will be deviations, of course, from that ideal type. But the ideal type for Weber represents the distinct characteristic of that religion. You may call it the essential. Durkheim is proposing a completely different approach, right? The ideal is not the essential. The ideal is not the essential because, and go back, we'll come to this in a minute, go back to Durkheim's rule of sociological method, right? Where again, he is repeatedly arguing that what is necessary for a science is to look at the average, look at what actually exists, look at the most widely prevalent form, not the ideal. Look at the most widely prevalent form. Okay, that would be the social fact. Okay, so here too, he is trying to identify precisely what are the most elementary facts of religion. And those facts are not ideal. They are the most elementary, permanent, enduring forms, the most elementary ones, which exist in all of human society, from the most primitive and simple to the most advanced and complex. Okay, now, in order to do this, Durkheim used ethnographies done by other people of aboriginal groups in Central Australia and North America, mostly Central Australia. Later commentators have actually shown that much of this ethnography that he was relying on was not very accurate. I mean, there have been much better accounts of these tribes later on. Van Gennep, for instance, he wrote a very sharp critique of Durkheim's book, and he showed that this data was often very unreliable. But that's a different question. We are not interested so much in the actual substance of Durkheim's discussion of the religion of the Australian Aboriginal peoples. But his method was to look at, as he said, he was going to look at the most primitive peoples, to look at ethnographic accounts of these groups. Now, one important assumption he was making was that simple societies or primitive societies will also have simple religion. That is to say, if a society was known to be one of the earliest forms of human society. Usually, so what are these Australian Aboriginal groups, or North American for that matter, many of the ones which Durkheim was discussing. These were small hunting-gathering groups, small bands, usually no more than a few dozen, maybe 100 or so, to a group. And the hunting band was usually always much smaller, 10, 12, 15 at the most. But a particular group, could be a clan, could be a village, and so on, was seldom more than a few hundred. So this was taken to be a simple society. But this did not necessarily mean that their religious ideas or religious practices were simple. And this is something, of course, we will have occasion to look at this. Lévi-Strauss in particular would later show that simple societies or primitive societies don't necessarily have very simple structures of thought. Their structures of thought could be extremely complex and subtle. But Durkheim was assuming that simple societies will also have simple religion. So he was essentially saying, on the analogy of biology or chemistry, let us look at the simplest cell structures, and that will give us a clue to how to understand more complex or developed structures. Questions so far? Now, why is the study of religion in primitive societies important at all? Right? Well, there are many other aspects of primitive society which one could have studied, or religion could have been studied in other ways, but why religion? And one of the reasons, and again, this is a very central part of Durkheim's method, he claimed that religion provides the fundamental categories of human intelligence. So the very basic categories with which human beings think, right? Categories such as space, time, force, identity, classification. That's basically how we, those are the basic tools of thinking. It is religion which first provides these categories to human beings. Now, this Durkheim actually is engaging here with quite a serious philosophical debate with established understandings in modern philosophy, particularly the philosophy of Kant, because, or broadly say, rationalism, of rational thought. Many philosophers, and this is from Durkheim, I'm basically paraphrasing Durkheim. Many philosophers, of course, most famously Kant, claim, he doesn't name Kant. Many philosophers claim that the categories, these fundamental categories, space, time, force, class, classification, identity, etc. These categories are true a priori, right? True by definition, not derived from experience. Because without them, no human thought is possible. So Kant's basic claim was that you cannot proceed to show the truth of something like space or time or number, right? Is space true? Is number true? Kant said it's a meaningless question. right? Because if these fundamental categories did not exist, if they were not true, then we would not be able to think at all. Even we would not even be able to pose that question, right? So to pose the question, for instance, is space true? Is time true? We would have to have those categories. Otherwise, how would you, pose a question like true or true and false? Because between true and false, all of those other categories of thinking are required prior, before you can pose any of those questions about whether something is true or not, right? Those are a priori categories, right? True by definition, axiomatically true. Because without them, no rational thought is possible. Now, Durkheim's argument was that this may be valid as a philosophical argument, but it does not explain how these categories come to be accepted, right? You could say that without some prior idea of time, you cannot begin to say, oh, I did this yesterday, I will going to do this tomorrow, right? You must have a prior idea of time. Durkheim is saying that may well be true philosophically, but in every given society, you must be able to show how a particular way of identifying time, identifying past from present, present from future. Every society has a particular way in which they collectively understand the notion of time. It may be in terms of calendars. It may be in terms of a sequence of festivals, right? There may be, and each society has its own way in which it educates its members to collectively understand the notion of time in this particular way, right? One of the key assumptions or claims, in fact, of Durkheim is that if there were not these shared collective understandings, communication would be impossible. So if I had my own particular way of understanding time or describing time, right, which none of you share, then of course communication would completely break down, right? So in order to be able to, so therefore this is in fact a definition that is constitutive of the idea of community itself. If there is a group or community that has a collective network of communication, then it must have a shared set of representations which everybody accepts of these fundamental categories, such as space, for instance. Every member of that particular group must have a certain shared way of describing that place, this place in relation to some other place, okay? And that representation may vary, or that method of representation may vary from one society to another. For instance, in our society, we have notions of north, south, east, west, for instance, right? Primitive societies don't necessarily have that particular way of describing space, right? I don't know if you have ever tried this, but for instance, if you are navigating, going from one place to another within the city of Kolkata, for instance, I think most of us would have a certain notion, which is, you might say, cartographic. We have in our minds a certain map of the city, and we have actually seen and worked with physical maps of the city over, from our school days, right? So in a sense, our understanding of space, spatial distribution of buildings, places, etc., within the city is very cartographic. Now, I don't know if you've tried actually speaking in detail with, let us say, a driver of an auto rickshaw or even a taxi, right? And of course, they have a perfectly good idea of how to go from one place to another. But if you actually talk to them over a length of time, you will find that their understanding of that space of the city, the spatial distribution of the city, is not necessarily cartographic, right? If you tell them which is east or west of or north of which, many of them will not be able to tell you, because that is not how space is arranged within their set of ideas, within their representation. But there must be a different way in which that space is actually represented and transmitted, right? Within a community which probably does not have the kind of education that we do, right? But Durkheim's point is this, that no matter what the particular way of representing things may be, these fundamental categories of thought are, in fact, collective representations, right? They are not simply axiomatic rational assumptions, as the philosopher would claim. They are, you have to explain socially how certain kinds of categories of rational thinking, those fundamental categories, how they come to be accepted in society. They must have social origins. Rationalist philosophy by itself cannot account for this. And so Durkheim's claim is collective representations bearing the authority of society imposes the categories of thought on individuals. So he's going back to the argument of collective representations or symbols, as he will call them. So this is the rationalist way of thinking. But there is a contrary empiricist way of thinking, right, about religion, which claims that religion as practice is based on representations of objects that vary between groups and individuals. Now, this is clearly true, that representations of even things like space and time and so on vary from society to society, right? Time, the sense of calendars, they often vary. And why do they vary? Because experience is the basis of religious practice. This would be the empiricist assumption. Religion is based upon experience, and experience varies not just between groups, but even between individuals. Now, pure empiricism must therefore deny the possibility of abstract universal thought in religion. It will result in irrationalism. If you have to hold on to a purely empiricist position, then you have to say that there is no place for abstract universal thought in religion. Religion is purely based upon a variety of experiences, a variable experience. And it could be completely irrational. In other words, religious practice or religious beliefs cannot be explained or understood in terms of rational thinking, because it is based upon experience. Now, this Durkheim finds unsatisfactory, because that would mean that rational thinking would have to be put outside the pale of religion. So this limitation of pure empiricism may be removed if we recognize the social, that is to say, the collective origin of religious practice. So Durkheim's emphasis is that it may be experience, and he's not denying the role of experience, but this experience must, in the end, result in certain social or collective representations, which are shared in society as a whole. So despite the variability of individual religious experience, right, certain shared representations must emerge, because only then would we have something that we may be able to call religion. Okay. So this sort of debate between rationalism and empiricism, Durkheim is claiming can be resolved if we look at or look for religion in collective representations, right? Different from individual. He's not saying that you cannot have individual understandings of religion or experience of religion, right? But religion per se is a collective, is a set of collective representations which society produces. Society, not individuals. Society is a reality sui generis. In itself, it is produced by society itself. Its representations are collective and different from individual ones. Okay? Collective representations or symbols are formed through social interactions over regions and historical time. So it emerges over time in history and in space, over regions, so over large numbers of people. Something like language is also a system of collective symbols, even something as basic as language. It is a human creation. I mean, language was not given by gods, no matter certain scriptures and so on may claim that, but that is not what it was. It was created by human groups, but a language can be a language only if it's shared, right, among a number of people. Those collective representations. Religion is of the same kind. Now, recall Durkheim's definition of the social fact. This is exactly what Durkheim had claimed was a social fact. A social fact is not just an individual fact. Something becomes a social fact, or what you will remember Durkheim called a thing, right? A social fact is a thing. It is a thing in the sense that it is something which is outside of individual consciousness, something that imposes itself on individuals, right? It is the way in which certain socially created or constructed representations, right, constrain or are imposed on individual consciousness. And the basic way in which this is done is through education. So education within society, the next generation is trained in these collective representations, which society itself has constructed as a general set of symbols. Religion is of this kind. Okay? So what Durkheim calls society, later anthropologists will call culture. It is a cultural construction, a cultural representation. And every culture has a set of representations of this kind, interconnected, right, which are shared by individuals within that culture, right? This religion is a system of this kind. Okay, so what Durkheim is doing here is stepping away from the debate between rationalists and empiricists. He is not denying rationalism. He is in fact saying that religion, in fact, is where the categories of rational thought are actually produced. It's within religion that they are produced. But religion is at the same time a set of representations based upon experience, right? It, as we will see, he will keep making this point that religious practices, different rituals, for instance, are all there as you know, as long-lasting sets of practices because they perform certain social functions. They satisfy certain social needs, okay? And in that sense, they become social facts. They are like things which are above and beyond individual, right? So we'll come to this very soon. Take any religious practice or observance. Okay, take fasting, for instance, religious fasting. Now, there are various beliefs that are associated with the ritual of fasting. You know, you need to fast on such and such a day, specific occasions, sometimes specific days of the calendar, right? Everybody does it. But of course, there are exceptions allowed. So not everybody will have to do it. So room for individual variations are allowed. But this practice of fasting, why one should fast, it is not necessarily something that each individual does out of one's own experience, right? That is an institution or a rule, a regulation, a collective practice which exists outside of individual wills. It is a collectively shared understanding of a particular, let's say, moral or theological. There could be all sorts of specific justifications for that practice or ritual. But it is a social fact, right? It is like a thing. Okay? So, once again, Durkheim is going back to the argument that we've already encountered in his discussion on the rules of sociological method, that although society is a human construction, it has a reality that is independent of individual wills. If the fundamental categories of rational thought exist, they do so because they have been collectively accepted as such and socially instituted. These collective constructions are not merely nominal. That is to say, they are not simply there by name, right? They have an existence as social things. They must be understood as another department of nature. In other words, they are natural. They are natural things. They have an existence as social things. This approach resolves the conflict between rationalism and empiricism by tracing the origins of both to society. So what he's doing is this approach will, he's claiming, resolve the conflict between rationalism and empiricism, because both the possibility of rational thinking as well as that of experience. That's to say, religion as experienced. Both of those can be accounted for as social constructions. Social constructions that are not merely by name. They are things, right? They are, as he's saying, understood as another department of nature. Just as there are natural things in the natural world which exist as natural, right? So religion too must be understood as being like natural objects. They're beyond individual experience. Okay, questions? Now, there are what Durkheim says certain false presuppositions or preconceptions about religion, which he would have to rule out before proceeding further to the definition of, to a proper definition of religion. Religion is not about the supernatural. And he has a very interesting argument why. Because he says the distinction between the natural and the supernatural only appears late in the advanced religion. Why does it appear late? Because supernatural events are not merely unexpected, but in fact impossible, right? Something that could not happen naturally, and therefore you attribute them to some supernatural force, some spirits, magical miracles, for instance, right? Such events may be identified as supernatural only after the natural world is understood as having its own laws. Okay, so for instance, take something like the eclipse. So there is a lunar eclipse or a solar eclipse. Now, these are relatively rare events. They don't happen every day, but they are not completely unprecedented. They happen from time to time. Okay, now, how do you account for an event like that? If the workings of the natural bodies, or the planetary bodies, were properly understood in terms of their rules, then of course, as today, the eclipse is not a miracle at all. The eclipse is a completely part of the natural motions of these bodies. We know exactly when a particular planet may, in a sense, basically, the shadow falls on the, let's say, the lunar eclipse, right? We now know that the sun's rays which fall on the moon, that is reflected to us. The moonlight is not light that is generated by the moon, right? It is sunlight which is reflected on the moon. And then if the earth comes in between, then there is an eclipse. Okay. But this, and so there is nothing supernatural in this. But when we look back on accounts in pre-modern societies of how societies regarded or explained the eclipse and what they did, okay, then you will find a lot of, for instance, mythologies about demons who were, in a sense, attacking the moon, okay, and biting a certain part of the moon, okay, and so those demons have to be propitiated, okay. So you have all of these mythologies and practices which were associated with it, which you would often call part of primitive religion. Now, Durkheim's argument is that in this primitive society, there is actually no distinction between natural and supernatural. Okay? There is no, because that distinction is understandable only for people like us who have or who claim to have an understanding of the natural world with its own laws. Right? But primitive people had no distinction between natural and supernatural. So you could not say that the religion of primitive people is about the supernatural. That is imposing our understanding on their construction. Right? We have to understand the beliefs and the rituals of historically prior societies, right? In terms of their understanding of natural objects and the place of, spirits, inanimate objects, all kinds of things, and we will see in a minute, which were part of, and there was no understanding that some of these were natural and others were not natural, right? Gods and spirits was as much part of the world, right, as trees and rivers and animals and birds and so on. So this is a false preconception, according to Durkheim. Religion is not about the supernatural. Okay. Another major preconception, which Durkheim actually spends quite a few pages scouting. Religion is not solely about gods, right? And in fact, he has a long, several pages on Buddhism, which he takes to be a major world religion, and Jainism too, which had no conception of God. But they had many rituals, they still have many rituals that are religious. So it is not necessary for religion to have a conception of God. You could have atheistic religions. Not only that, what he's saying is that even theistic religions, religions with God, have many practices, such as, for instance, restrictions on food and dress. Right? There are lots of, major religions which have a whole set of restrictions of what you can eat and what cannot eat, and how you must dress, and different groups of people, men, women, gradations within that society, how they must dress. But these restrictions have nothing to do with God. And yet they are religious rules of that religion. So you can have religion without God, and you can have religious practices without God, even within theistic religion. So both theistic and non-theistic religions must be included within the definition of religion. This is another major, so he actually discusses earlier authors on religion, where, for instance, they assume that religion must have a conception of the divine. Religion is about the conceptions of the divine and various things that follow from that. Durkheim is rejecting this because this would give you a very incomplete understanding of religion. It would not be a universal definition of religion. In fact, look at the example of Buddhism, which Durkheim actually discusses some length. The doctrines of Buddhism do not recognize a creator God. There is creation, which according to Buddhism has always existed. Buddhism is really uninterested in the origins of creation. Creation has always existed. What is happening is the transformation within created things from one to another. Forms keep changing. Okay. Nor does the path of salvation, nirvana, okay, require the mediation of a priest. It is individual meditation, an individual exercise in religious discipline, which can take individuals on the path of salvation. There is, strictly speaking, no priest who intervenes. Even though some forms of practiced Buddhism involve the veneration of the Buddha as a sort of God. So you do have temples where there are idols of the Buddha, images of the Buddha, and there are different forms in which you could say people actually worship the Buddha or other venerated figures. So you could say that there is some form of worship of something like a god. Bhagavan is often a term that's used. These are derivative and deviant cults. Now, Durkheim is actually making an interesting distinction because for him, all of this is social. He has to account for them as social. So on the one hand, you have the social fact that there is Buddhism with a very well-developed philosophical, textual body of scripture, which scriptural doctrines or theological doctrines, where there is no creator God. In fact, many commentators have described Buddhism as an atheistic religion. It was called Nastika, right? I mean, Brahminican adversaries always identified the Buddhists as Nastikas for all sorts of reasons, because Buddhists did not accept the authority of the Vedas. They did not accept Ishvara. There were a whole series of things where they were Nastikas. But at the same time, as Durkheim says, depending upon the accounts of various other people, that we do see in different parts of the world, in Asia in particular, the emergence of certain forms of, you might say, Buddha worship. But these are specific cults. And according to Durkheim, it is an interesting empirical problem to inquire into how an essentially atheistic religion comes to acquire such cults of divine worship. And for Durkheim, the explanation must lie in some kind of social analysis. There is some social need that was being served by the addition of certain cults of worship of the Buddha, which the high philosophical Buddhism did not accept. Okay, but certain popular forms did. And so that would be specifically a sociological question to answer how. But the crucial methodological point for Durkheim is that both the theistic and the non-theistic must be included within the definition of religion. Now, two major sort of subdivisions of religion. One, beliefs, and the other, rites or rituals. Beliefs are opinions expressed in representations. Rites are determinate modes of action. Okay, beliefs are opinions expressed in representations. They are opinions, views, ideas, which are expressed in collective signs, symbols. Rites or rituals are specific modes of action, practice. A ritual is a special rule of practice, distinguished by its object. Every ritual has an object. That object is expressed in the belief. So when there is a particular ritual, let us say a sacrifice, right? Or let us say something like a Catholic mass, okay, a prayer meeting, a fast. These rituals, or rituals of worship, for instance, puja. Every ritual is meant to have an object. This ritual is performed for this reason, for this purpose. And that purpose is expressed in terms of a certain belief. So a sacrifice, for instance, a yajna. A yajna is performed for a certain purpose. And the purpose may be to, let us say, propitiate ancestors, right? An offering for the ancestors. Now that is a belief. The ancestors are not around, you don't see them, right? But you offer various sacrificial objects, right? In order to propitiate, some people will say to remember, okay? Offerings are made to one's ancestors. Now, this is a belief. Similarly, for instance, fasting. Fasting is supposed to be for something, to, in the expectation of, good harvest, in the expectation of good health, prosperity, all sorts of things, right? It is also a certain form of sacrifice, fasting. Again, there is an object which is expressed in terms of a certain religious belief. A belief in, once again, propitiating gods, spirits. There may even be a much more direct causal kind of understanding between doing a particular ritual and obtaining a particular result. So that particular rituals are meant for particular results. We'll come to this because this is where there's an interesting problem between religion and magic, but we'll come to this in a minute. So on the one side, you have beliefs. On the other, we have rites or rituals, and they are connected in this way. And then it is for having made this, laid this ground, Durkheim offers his fundamental claim about religion. What is religion? And he claims that he has arrived at the elementary essence of all religion in every possible human society. All religions known, which of course must have both belief and rite or ritual, right? But what is the most permanent, universal, elementary essence? And that is, all religions classify all things, real and ideal, into two opposed classes, profane and sacred. This is Durkheim's basic claim, right? What is religion? All religions do one particular thing, which is classify all possible objects in the world, right? Both real objects that you see around you, as well as ideal ones, imagined objects. So you can have gods, spirits, etc., all of those kinds of things. There are two classes, sacred and profane. Sacred, we'll describe what sacred means. Sacred attaches itself to things that are identified as worthy of special respect, veneration, worship. Okay? Anything can be sacred because we have examples from, and this is what Durkheim will describe, from the most primitive peoples. It doesn't have to be gods and spirits. See, only gods are not sacred. A rock, a tree, a spring, a book, anything can be sacred. But sacred things are identified as such in a particular religion. It will identify certain things as sacred. And those sacred things will inspire veneration and awe, right? You will treat those sacred objects in a special way, creating a moral community around it. This special veneration or regard for sacred things will be shared in a community. Only then is it religion, right? A shared veneration in a community where everybody agrees that these things are sacred. It could be spaces, it could be objects, right? It could be imagined things like God, for instance. Okay, but they are sacred. All that is not sacred is profane, meaning they belong to the ordinary mundane world. There's no special veneration or respect for those things. They are just objects that one transacts with in the ordinary world. Okay, that is the profane world. The sacred world is defined separately. Durkheim's claim is this is what every religion does, and the most basic thing that it must do. Right? Define what is sacred. And that, of course, will define what is not sacred. This is the key operation, the distinctive or essential feature of every religion. The key to this argument is Durkheim's claim that sacred and profane do not mix. Okay, they cannot mix. They have to be kept separate. There is a sharp opposition. There is a sharp opposition between sacred and profane things. The distinction is absolute and there are no overlaps. This is absolutely crucial to Durkheim's definition. Those things that are sacred cannot be mixed with the profane things. Everyone understands in this community, in this society, everyone understands this is sacred. This space is sacred. You have to treat it differently from other spaces. You know, think of, let's say, you know, the inside chamber of a temple with an idol, right? In most Hindu temples. That inner space has a special quality of sacredness, right? Only certain people can enter. You can only enter after undergoing a certain set of rituals, right? Which is purification, etc. Not everyone can touch the idol. So all of these things, and every religion will have variations on what is sacred and what is not. But Durkheim's key argument is you cannot have overlaps. There is no idea of things which are hybrid, which are mixed. The distinction is absolute and there are no overlaps. there are visible signs by which sacred and profane are distinguished. And so there are interdictions on the mixing of the two. Sacred objects, for instance, may not be touched except by authorized persons who have been ritually purified. And there can be all rules of, around sacred objects or sacred spaces. Now, there is an interesting way in which there can be passages. It's not mixing, but there may be passages from one to the other. So one is, of course, a rite of purification, some ritual of purification. So, for instance, someone when offering or doing a worship, a particular ritual of worship, the person who's doing it may have to undergo a series of rituals of purification before directly engaging with this sacred object or space, right? That is to be worshipped. But there's a different kind of passage. Someone who is not entitled to one stage may pass into an entitled stage. So this is very often called a rite of passage. And every society has rites of passage. So for instance, over age. So from children to adulthood, there are specific rites of passage. When socially, one is recognized as having passed from the stage of being a child to that of an adult, right? For women, for instance, puberty is very often one such rite of passage, and many, many societies and religions have specific rituals associated with the attaining of puberty. In primitive societies, for instance, the ones that Durkheim was writing about, which are mostly warrior, hunter-gatherer societies. So there are elaborate rites of passage when young boys, having been trained and so on, actually become recognized, socially recognized, as entitled to join a hunting band. There are elaborate rites of passage, right? You go through those rites of passage, and then you are entitled, socially entitled, to do all of those things that a proper hunter is allowed to do. And hunting is associated, of course, this is, for these societies, this was a very, very essential mode of livelihood, right? And hunting had enormously complicated sets of rules. What you could kill, when you could kill, who could kill what, right? Even not only just killing, even gathering fruits from which trees you could gather fruits or leaves from, which you couldn't. Okay, there were elaborate rules. Even Australians, there is a very, very widely understood sets of rules which regulated which parts of the forest, which trees, which rivers or water bodies, which animals, which birds could be hunted or gathered from, right? And who could do it, who in society could do it. There were also seasons and so on and so forth. Clearly, they had a great deal to do with interactions with the local ecology, the ecological cycles, seasonal cycles, and all sorts of things must have. And there are very elaborate explanations that ethnographers and anthropologists have provided. This is, of course, much later than Durkheim. As I said, the ethnography that Durkheim relied on was a very early and often quite crude ethnography. But the basic argument was still this, and many people could think that it's still possible to hold Durkheim's basic thesis that religion is about the distinction between the sacred and the profane, and the two don't mix. There are very strict rules of keeping them separate and of allowing for a very well-regulated and marked, clearly marked passage from one to the other, right? Through specific rituals, rites of passage, as they call it. So you come to the final definition of religion. So when sacred things are related to each other to form a system with a certain unity, the totality of those beliefs and the corresponding rites constitute a religion. Okay, so sacred things are related to each other. So it's not just between individuals in society and a sacred object, but in all, even in the most primitive religions, there are many sacred objects, and they are related to one another in specific ways, in particular ways. Okay, and they form, as it were, a system of sacred objects with a certain unity. The totality of those beliefs and the corresponding practices or rituals, that constitutes a religion. Now, Durkheim is also adding to this another key methodological approach, which is that of evolution. So this definition that he's proposed will hold even for the most primitive society. Even in the most primitive society, you have a set of sacred objects or things which are related to one another. They form some kind of unity. And that totality of beliefs and rituals you would call primitive religion for that society. But that society evolves. It becomes more complex. What happens then to primitive religion? It no longer stays primitive, right? It develops more complex kinds of beliefs, sometimes more abstract beliefs, beliefs in an abstract, for instance, monotheistic religions, when they evolve, they come much later, of course. But monotheistic religions very often, like Islam, for instance, will have the conception of a God who has no natural attributes at all, completely abstract, right? No form, right? Who cannot have any natural qualities. Now, that is a completely abstract philosophical concept. Now, when that appears, that is related to other things which are worldly, okay? But that emergence of religion must be explained again socially, right? As an evolution from earlier forms. And in doing that, one would often find, and this is what Durkheim is observing, that folklore, folk practices, rituals, folk rites, or ceremonies often survive from earlier forms of primitive religion, often survives without the corresponding belief. Okay, so for instance, in Europe, Christian, fairly modern Christian, even today, you have May Day carnivals, right? Now, it's well understood that the May Day carnival was not in origin a Christian festival at all, but it has nothing to do with Christianity. It comes from earlier forms, pre-Christian forms of folk religion, but they have survived, okay, without the corresponding belief. Or sometimes new religious beliefs are attributed to old rituals. So for instance, the festival of Holi, which takes place in North India, was now everywhere, but it is the North Indian festival, and it's been well established that Holi was originally had nothing to do with Vaishnavism or any of the relatively modern religions, right? Holi actually was much more of a folk festival, but it acquired the more developed religious attributes of, let's say, an association with Krishna and Radha and so on and so forth, which is a later attribution. You can have many examples of this kind. So here again, Durkheim's sort of evolutionism is playing a part here. So mark what Durkheim is trying to achieve. On the one hand, he's trying to arrive at an elementary definition of religion, which can be shown to exist in every known form of human society, from the earliest, the most primitive, to the most developed or advanced, right? What is that which is central, permanent, essential? And that, according to Durkheim, is the separation between the sacred and the profane. Now, having advanced this, he will then also have to explain the evolution from the primitive forms to the advanced forms. How would you explain? In all of this, this one key factor remains. But of course, the associated beliefs and practices will change, right? There will be more hierarchically organized, graded forms of rationalism on the one side, experiential religious practices on the other. There will be hierarchies, and there will be an incorporation of prevailing practices from earlier, social formation, prevailing practices which may survive into the later ones. Okay, all of this has to be sociologically accounted for. And there is an interesting section in those first two chapters on the relation between magic and religion. Religious rites often claim to bring about magical results. So, for instance, sacrifice. Very often the belief is that if you perform a particular kind of sacrifice, you will get a particular kind of result. In this sense, you could claim that magic is part of religion because it is a practice common to the religious community. Okay, but when magic is performed without giving rise to a church or a community of believers, it is not part of religion. Now, this is an interesting distinction that Durkheim is making. Because between one kind of magic, which is part of religious ritual or practice, which is shared by the religious community, right? And is practiced within that community. Okay, so it is within a particular religious community that some magical forms are part of religious ritual. But you could have the practice of magic, which is not necessarily shared by a particular community of believers. So, for instance, faith healing or the veneration of saints with magical powers or shamanism, okay? The advice of astrologers, right? Astrologers may tell you, well, do this, wear this particular stone or something like that, and you will have this result. The faith healing, for instance, the employment of ojas, jadutona, right? Jhadpok, those kinds of magical practices. The wearing of amulets, tabis, and so on. Now, according to Durkheim, these kinds of magical practices by magical professionals, right? they can be practiced and used by people of all religions, right? You don't have to be part of a particular religious community in order to avail of or practice that particular form of magic. In that case, it is magic. It is not religion. Okay. Very interestingly, for instance, you can think of for instance, the widely practiced forms of popular Islam, where the veneration of saints, of sheikhs and peers, particularly their graves, where lots of people will go with specific kinds of requests and particular kinds of wishes will be made. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to be a particular follower of a particular sect or anything at all. Anybody can do this. This particular kind of religious practice, of magical practice, according to Durkheim, is not religious, because it goes against Durkheim's basic premise, which is that the religious practice must be associated with a religious belief which is shared by a particular community. It is that community which gives it that particular meaning. Okay, it is not up to individuals. Whereas this kind of use of magical practice is really up to individuals, right? Anybody can actually feel that, well, let me go to this mazar and pray and do some offering, because it could be curing an illness, it could be a whole set of things. Now, so this is the distinction between magic and religion that Durkheim is making. He then makes a very interesting statement again, which is what is happening to religion in modern Europe. He's writing in the early 20th century, when already there is a distinct phase of secularization of public religion that is happening in Europe. Lots of people are no longer religious in that sense. Church going is dropping, and people no longer claim to believe in the doctrinal aspects of religion anymore. Many people do not practice the rituals. So secularization, is religion about to disappear? Now, this would be a very interesting problem for Durkheim, because he has been claiming that religion is an essential part of human society from its earliest phase in all known historical society, right? So what happens to human society if religion disappears? Even if religious beliefs and practices decline in society through secularization, Durkheim's claim is their place is taken by collective ceremonies and ideologies, such as nationalism, for instance, that perform the same function as religion. There is then a set of secular national objects that are defined as sacred, such as the flag or the anthem, or you can think of many other, it could be specific spaces, sites that are, or for instance, martyrdom, the remembering of martyrs. Very similar to what happens in Christianity or Islam. Okay, so secular national objects that are defined as sacred. The same rules of separation of the sacred from the profane are applied. So according to Durkheim, even sitting in Europe in the early 20th century, when secularization is proceeding very, very quickly, Durkheim's claim is that the essential function, don't forget, his basic premise is functional. There is a need in human society that religion fulfills. That need is still there, and something like religion will come in its place and define sacred objects as distinct from profane objects. This will no longer necessarily be in terms of religion. It could be in terms of political ideologies, right? Where, once again, there will be things that will be defined as politically sacred, right? Which will be deserving of special veneration and awe, okay? Which people will respect, which will be treated in special particular ways. Particular authorized people will be entitled to touch them, pray to them, etc., etc. There will be rituals associated with them, which will be defined, which will not be religious rituals. They will be political ceremonies, political rituals. Okay, and the same functions will be performed. So finally, Durkheim's influence. Two very clear influences besides others. Durkheim's theory of religious ritual and belief as satisfying social needs is the foundation of functionalist anthropology. So later, for instance, the famous ones, Malinowski, Ratcliffe Brown, and many others. This was dominant form of anthropology in the middle of the 20th century. Functionalism, or sometimes called structural functionalism. Basically, the premise was, like Durkheim, to say or to identify social institutions, social practices as serving or fulfilling certain social needs. The assumption is that if you find a particular practice in a particular society, that practice is there. It may seem completely ridiculous for an outsider. Why should anybody do this peculiar thing? And some of them were sometimes bizarre. Some were, at least for Western observers, many would probably think of them as horrible, barbarous, cruel. Many of these practices, for an outsider would seem extremely unpleasant. And yet they were performed. The functional theory of anthropology basically said that if these things were being performed, then one must proceed on the premise that it fulfilled some social need. And the anthropologist's task was to identify that need. What function was it performing in that society? That is how the internal justification, the justification could be the local people may have their own way of explaining the reason. Okay, that would be the corresponding religious belief, right? People within that society would probably tell the anthropologist that we do this because we believe this is what happens, right? That is why we do this. But the anthropologist must have a more objective understanding of that practice performing some social function. That social function may not be obvious to the practitioners of that society, but the anthropologist should be able to identify that practice. That would constitute a good explanation, a sociological explanation of that practice. This was the foundation of functionalist anthropology, as we've seen, Durkheim, in a sense, was already advancing this argument. Now, of course, later, the criticism of the functionalist explanation became very strong, and the criticism was this, that in a sense, this is a completely tautological scheme of explanation, right? You are saying that something exists because it must perform a need, right? The existence itself is explained by a need. The need does not actually explain the existence, right? You are simply inferring a need from the fact that a practice exists. If a practice exists, then your inference must be that there must be a need. Now, a lot of people would later make the argument, this is no explanation at all, right? You're simply inferring an explanation from the mere fact that something exists. So functionalism today, for instance, would not pass as a very good sociological explanation, but it was quite influential for a long, long time. And the origins could be traced back to Durkheim. The other very major development in mid-20th century anthropology was, of course, structuralism or structural anthropology, especially Lévi-Strauss. And Durkheim's claim that the essential element in religion was the separation of the sacred from the profane led to the method of structural anthropology, because the root is this, that once again, every society consists of structures, and the structures are formed or defined in terms of basic elements of contradictory separation between this and its opposite. Okay, sacred, the opposite is profane. You proceed from this very simple relation and then proceed to add up more and more complex combinations of structures, right? With subdivisions and sub-oppositions, etc. This would be the key method of structural anthropology later. And we will come to at least some initial statement of Lévi-Strauss's method of structural anthropology. Don't forget, very interestingly, just as Durkheim's book was called Elementary Forms of Religious Life, Lévi-Strauss, one of his major works, is called The Elementary Forms of Kinship, Elementary Structures of Kinship. Okay, so the elementary idea, or elementary structure, elementary form, this becomes a key methodological premise in another. So therefore, this second very major strand of anthropological or sociological social thought in middle of the 20th century, which is structuralism or structural anthropology. Of course, there's a whole structural linguistics which grew up around the same time, had very strong connections with structural anthropology. We will talk about that a little bit more when we discuss Lévi-Strauss. So let me stop here, and we can have a little bit of discussion. We have a few minutes time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Partha. If anyone has a question, please just ask, unmute yourself, ask. Well, as you kind of are thinking about your questions, or kind of, I have a question as well too, which is, Partha, can I ask a question?
Yes, begin.
So I'm actually thinking about play. When we are looking at the religious, kind of the ritualistic, the religious, there are quite a few overlaps with play. Play as ritual, ritual play. Does Durkheim actually kind of talk about play as a social, and he's very opposite right now, football as religion, but I mean, does he talk about play in such terms, really?
Now I'll have to recall, for instance, in the religion book, you see, there are many, for instance, in a whole set of ethnographic discussions of hunting-gathering societies. What would be play is often part of the ritual preparations. For its, the training for hunting very often involved play of different kinds, including competitive play, as training for young boys who were being trained to become hunters. There are also accounts of actual hunting, which are represented as play. Because in many of these kinds of societies, as we know, for instance, there are all kinds of totemic objects, and things like birds, animals, trees, natural objects, all were attributed with will, with consciousness. They were all often understood as being in kind of active interaction, including playful interaction with humans. So this entire world that is peopled with natural objects, spirits, and so on. Spirits, very often. So there are a whole set of relations, including all kinds of emotional relations. So there is hostility, there is friendship, there is kinship, there is obviously playfulness. All of this becomes part of the understanding of this interaction between humans and their surroundings. And as Durkheim says, there is no understanding of a distinction between the natural and the non-natural. They're all sort of, and the human, in fact, the social and the natural, because as we know, the totemic relationships effectively means that there are kinship relationships between humans or groups of humans and things that we would today understand as being part of nature. It got nothing to do with living human beings. But primitive peoples and their religion often established clear kinship relations between these categories. So yes, there is play, and the category of play does come in many of the ethnographic accounts, but specifically to understand this as play, as distinct from something else, non-play. I don't immediately recall something
Right.
like that. Something like that. So, in some ways, the distinction between play as essentially, some kind of active engagement with others within constructed sets of rules, right? These rules are understood to be constructed and not given by nature. Now, that kind of understanding, I don't know, Durkheim might even say that that's a construction which we can make, because we have a certain understanding of nature and the rules of nature. And play, for instance, will often use the characteristics of natural objects, but bring them into interaction with humans according to a set of rules that are constructed by humans. So, for instance, you play with the ball has a completely, it has its characteristics as a natural object, it behaves that way. But within a set of constructed rules, you can define a way in which you can, as it were, play with a ball within those sets of rules, and then decide who is doing it better or worse, and so on.
Yes.
So in some ways, you could make the argument that pre-modern societies or even primitive societies often did things which we today would probably regard as play, but the distinction between play and non-play was probably not there.
So, I mean, I don't know if anyone else has questions. I have follow-up questions to this. I'm sure I can find Partha and ask him later, bother him later. But if you have questions, please ask now. Anyone? I know that some of them, Partha, are having internet problems because I can see them dropping out and joining. Yeah, so it must be something. Maybe the whole world is on Reliance Jio at the moment. But yeah.
Rajoshi Dashgupta. Yeah.
Yes, Rajoshi has a question. So shall I read it out, Partha, or?
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Yeah, I'll read it. Sir, does Durkheim say anything about why this division between the sacred and the profane, the act upon which religion is essentially predicated, becomes such a universal necessity? So
yes, yes. So basically, Durkheim's argument is that the sacred produces a certain special sense of reverence, right? A certain special respect for certain objects or symbols, which the entire community regards as particularly valuable. Okay, so in a sense, what he's suggesting is that it is this respect for the sacred, common respect for the sacred, which everybody observes, that creates the solidarity, the emotional solidarity of a community. That is what religion supplies. So the religion supplies this emotional sense of solidarity of a group by identifying specific symbols or representation for which everyone in that group is supposed to have some special reverence. Okay, and that is associated with a set of practices which are rituals, religious rituals, which is about precisely observing that special status of the sacred. So you can have specific occasions of worship, you can have specific methods by which only specific people may, after performing certain purificatory rituals, approach that sacred object. There can be whole sets of rules which is specifically associated with observing the sacredness of that object. Okay, now you can think of this much more easily when Durkheim is making that claim that even if you did not have religion per se as we understand it, you would still have this need, which is in a secular society too, he is claiming, you will still need some objects of sacredness, some sacred objects, such as the flag, right? Such as the martyr's tomb or column, right? Such as the anthem. Those would be, some national ceremonies. Those would be these sacred objects or sacred spaces associated with sacred rituals. This is there to mark the collective emotional bond of that society, which religion performs, and which even in a non-religious society, in a secularized society, you could have that being performed by a political ideology, for instance, which performs that same function. So this is his functionalist explanation of religion.
Rajoshi, does that answer your second question, which is a follow-up? I think was, I think Partha has addressed.
What's the second one?
It's what exactly is supposed to be the social purpose that this division serves?
Yeah, that's the
so
social purpose.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's kind of like. So any other questions? I think there are no other questions, Partha. So I guess. Oh, okay. There is one. There's a follow-up from Rajoshi. Sir, would that imply that the sacred and the secular need not be completely opposed?
No, in fact, what he's saying is that the secular national, or the secular in this sense, will also create its own distinctions between the sacred and the profane. So even in a secularized society, you will have certain objects in certain spaces which will be understood to be sacred, and others which are not, which are just ordinary profane areas where you can fight and debate, and you could have all sort of competitions of democracy and competition between parties and everything else. You can have debates, but certain kinds of things which will remain. For instance, you could make the argument that in some ways the specific position that, let us say, the Constitution is supposed to have, right? It's almost like a holy book. Very often the reference to a constitution, you see this even today in our country, for instance, when people will absolutely fight, to kill their political competitors, but they will all say, we have respect for the Constitution, right? Constitution, as though it was like a holy book. Even though a constitution is supposed to have been made only the other day in a constituent assembly by so many people, and the constitution itself has provisions for changing its articles, right? It has a procedure of amending it, but there is a certain status that is given to it, which is almost like that of a sacred object. And a Durkheimian would say that this is because there is felt to be a need for this integrated function, a function to emotionally integrate a nation, right? Which internally may well be divided into a whole range of parties and ideologies and whatever else. But there is a need to integrate them. And this is done through this collective representation of a symbol, namely the Constitution, which is given a certain status of sacredness. So you can think of the same thing with the national flag and the national anthem and other things of this kind. Yes.
Any more questions? Anyone? Okay. She just says, thank you so much. So, in which case, I'm just tempted to ask one last question then.
Yes.
There may be many last, or Partha, shall we leave it until later? Because I think we are kind of...
as you wish. I mean,
oh, I just wanted to ask about kind of work as sacred and play as profane. I mean, bringing you to the Christian kind of...
Yes, sure. But that is going back to Weber.
Yes, that's why I wanted to ask it, because we were talking about Weber last time, and so
sure, that is enough. I mean, you can think of, in Weber's sense. Of course, what Weber was doing was,
and how does Durkheim, respond to this at all, if at all? That's what.
Well, if you see, the where Durkheim would disagree would be in the way in which Weber interprets this as some kind of ideal type. Okay, so Protestant, for instance, Weber could not actually make the claim that in every modern capitalist society, every capitalist behaves in this way. That is clearly not true. Okay, so Weber could not actually claim that every capitalist in England was a Calvinist or a Puritan, right? Behaving in that, what he himself called this extremely inhuman way of believing that work was the duty to God, and that one should have absolutely no spontaneous behavior, no spontaneous expressions of joy or pleasure or anything of the kind. Obviously, this is not true as a description of ordinary practice of businessmen in Britain. And Weber was never claiming that that was the case, right? Weber's method was interpretive. where he is specifically saying this is the construction of an ideal type. Okay, now this is not Durkheim's method. In fact, he says somewhere, which is a kind of tangential comment on Weber, that his method does not proceed according to the ideal, right? It has to proceed according to the invariant and universal practice. Now, invariant and universal practice, Durkheim could not necessarily claim that in English society in the 18th century, whenever, the invariant practice of religion was to separate work from play. Work was sacred, play was profane. Now, this was not an elementary and universal and permanent feature of English society. That is clearly not. Okay, so he would not make that kind of claim. Although he could certainly make a claim that the distinction between sacred and profane could become a justification for some people claiming or trying to educate others to regard work as distinct from play,
Right.
because work was like a sacred duty.
Yeah.
Okay, so the distinction was between sacred and profane. What is sacred is, for instance, one's duty to God. Now, this Durkheim could well claim was universal in Christian society. Now, what are those practices
Yes.
which constitute duty to God? That could vary from individual to individual. The ideal was simply that which becomes pedagogical. The ideal is that through which the leaders of society would try to educate. And there you could certainly make that distinction between work and play as a pedagogical technique of separating between what is worth doing and what is not so much worth doing, but or at least it was only mundane, whereas this was something special. Work was special, whereas play, the claim was not necessarily to avoid play altogether, but regarded as being less important than work, which was special.
Thanks, Partha. That is really interesting, actually. I mean, and I've always wanted to hear what Durkheim would think about Weber in this. Yeah. So I guess if there are no more questions, shall we end today's session?
Sure. We have one more session on Weber,
Yes.
which is on legitimation. Yes.
So
legitimate authority. Yes.
And the readings are already online, so
they're all there.
we'll all be able to do that. So in which case, well,
Thank you very much.
Next Wednesday. Thank you very much, Partha.
Yeah.
Stopping the recording.